to Anne at A.W. Eaton. And Anne is
Please
an
call me
associate to Anne, associate professor of philosophy at the University of Illinois at Chicago.
Thank you. I want to thank Sarah and Ivan for this, and all of you who have presented so far. I've learned so much. I'm full. I feel like I could go home right now. I've had such a great time, and I have so much to think about. So I'm really grateful to you all for that. I'm going to, being a philosopher, I'm going to get kind of abstract here, and I'd like to think about in my paper artifact function in particular. I got going on this project when I started noticing that whenever we try to ascribe a function to an artifact, we're always drawing on some broader context. Function, it seems, isn't something that you can glean purely from the material properties of an object alone. There's always something beyond that we're pointing to in order to justify the ascription of function. So that got me thinking about just what we mean by function in the first place. So that's a kind of conceptual question. Then a kind of ontological question about how it is that artifacts acquire functions, where they come from, you might say. And an epistemological question that kind of piggybacks on the ontological one, which is just how we then know what an object's function is. So those are the questions I'm going to explore in this paper. And so I'll just start by talking about the conceptual one. So this is just a question about the concept of function and what it is that we want a concept of function to do. And this is the place where I would like to make a plug for the normative, which I feel like has taken a kind of bad rap so far today, and in ways that I don't quite understand. So I'm hoping that y'all can explain some of this to me. But it seems to me that we want a concept of function to be normative, in the sense that, and what I mean by normative is appeal to some standard or criterion that the object could fail to instantiate or achieve. So a function is something that an object could fail to achieve. You could attribute a function to an object, but the object itself might fail to achieve that function, and in that way be defective. So there's the normative talk. And this reminds me of early in the day when Laura said, I think we need to be talking about success. It looks like success is one of the things that's tying a lot of these papers together. And then it seemed like there was some rejection of that, as, no, that's a normative concept. Success implies things like progress. And I thought, it seemed right to me, but then it felt like a lot of people disagreed with that. So that's one of the things that it seems to me we could, I'm hoping we can talk about it. But as far as I understand the concept of function, it needs to be something that an object could fail to achieve, or could achieve, and that way would be a success. And the reasons that it fails to achieve that function are multiple, and I'll talk about them in a second. I have a list here. So here are some of the things that a concept of function normatively construed in this way allows us to do. So I'm hoping that when I say these things, you all are going to think, oh yes, that we do in fact want a normative conception of function, because we want to be able to do these things. So I'll give you my little list. We want to be able to attribute a function to artifacts that are unused or rarely used. So even if, this were never used to hold water or some liquid, if it just sat on a shelf unused for its entire life before it were destroyed, we would still want to say that the function of this cup is to hold some kind of a liquid. So it actually never achieved its function, it never instantiated it, but we nevertheless want to be able to attribute the function to the object. Importantly, in order to explain what it is. I mean, that's how we explain what this thing is. So the function is deeply tied to the thing's identity. To be able to distinguish an artifact's accidental effects from its function. So the example I use in my paper is a little silly, but I like it. This happens in movies sometimes, that a belt buckle saves the hero's life, saves him from a stray bullet. Steel belt buckle and the bullet bounces off of it. But the fact that there's this, in this case, adventitious, very accidental effect doesn't mean that the belt buckle's function is deflecting bullets. It just happened to have done that once, and this happens all the time with artifacts, that they accidentally have all kinds of roles. But my point is, appealing to a normative conception of function allows us to make that distinction. No, that's not its actual function. Its function is something else. This is just something that happened. Another distinction is between idiosyncratic and transient uses of an artifact and its function. So for instance, I was thinking about the glass tubes that Sarah was talking about earlier today that initially had some other function, but an inventor needed a glass tube to serve some role, and so he took them and used them for this other purpose. And then maybe eventually started producing something of that sort for that purpose. But initially, we don't want to say the function of the glass tubes is this role in this machine to generate electricity. We want to make a distinction between those. To account for malfunction and distinguish it from simply failing to have a function at all. So I think it's important to be able to, that everybody in this room, as I've heard you talking so far, I feel like many of you have wanted to appeal to cases in which an artifact doesn't perform the role that it's supposed to. There's the normative talk again. It's supposed to do something. And it doesn't for various reasons. It might be broken, it might be malformed. And you don't want to say that the shoe that's so malformed from the beginning that it's unwearable has no function because unwearable, because then it wouldn't be a shoe. You want to be able to say, no, it's a deformed shoe or a malformed shoe or a broken shoe or something. And those are all normative concepts. It's a shoe that fails to do what shoes are supposed to do or something like that. I mean, the normativity doesn't have to be heavy-duty moral normativity, like naughty shoe or something. It's a morally bad shoe. Normativity comes in degrees. So I'm talking about the kind of normativity that goes along with just thinking that something fails to achieve something it's supposed to achieve, that kind of normativity. Where am I at for time? How am I doing with that ladybug?
I don't know. I keep the ladybug out of sight. Well, you've got 5 minutes.
I've got 5 minutes, thank you. So, okay. So it seems to me, and this is what I argue for in this paper, that the best way to explain this kind of normativity with respect to artifact function is to do it teleologically, by which I mean to do it by appealing to something like an aim or a purpose or a goal of the object in question. So purpose is a great stand-in for this kind of what we call teleological talk that attributes to something an aim or a purpose. So the shoe doesn't achieve its purpose, doesn't do what it's supposed to do, or it aims to do, or it's trying to do, or something like that. And the thing that makes many philosophers uncomfortable with that kind of talk is that it either seems anthropomorphizing or metaphorical. Like you don't really mean the shoe strives to be worn on the foot or something like that. You must mean something else. Because our paradigmatic example of goals or purposes are those of intending agents. So to attribute a goal to an inanimate object would seem to many philosophers to be sneaking in some kind of agential concept where there oughtn't be one. So what I try to do in the paper is to justify this teleological talk that'll give us the normativity that we want from a concept of function, and to do it naturalistically, so not by attributing, something like mental states to inanimate objects. And for the sake of time, I'll skip the part where I tell you about the ways that people try to do this that fail and why I think they fail, and I'll just tell you about my account, which is an etiological account. by that I mean I'm trying to get a concept of function that is teleological and normative by thinking about the history of the type of the thing and the performances for which things of that kind, artifacts of that kind, were selected for. So it's a model of kind of artificial selection applied to artifacts. So ancestors of the shoe were selected and reproduced because they performed some function, because they performed in some way or another. I won't use the word function because I'm defining function for you, so I won't be circular about it. So there's an activity that ancestors of this artifact performed well and suited the needs of people at that time. And I'm construing needs as broadly as we want. I mean, the needs could be aesthetic. It doesn't have to be just, bodily or something. And so the artifacts of that type were selected and reproduced on the basis of that performance. And that performance is the one that we call the proper function. That's the one to which we attribute the normative weight. And then it may be that, you can do other things with shoes, or, there are lots of other things that they can do, but those are not their proper function in this way. And let me just see what else it is I wanted to tell you about this. So about progress, I'll just say, and about success in this kind of thing, it seems to me quite reasonable to say that an artifact is a successful instantiation of a type. But it's important to understand that that's not success tout court. That's not success in some grand sense. It's always relative to a context. If you wanted to use biological talk, to a niche in which and this is actually what I'm supposed to be talking about, but this was all the wind-up. The niche is the context in which the artifact is developed. And so there are needs, and there are practices, and there are skills, and artifacts don't just respond to those, but they also develop them. They teach us to develop a whole set of skills. So what I should have done is found one of these videos of, I don't know if y'all have ever seen someone who's used basically chopsticks their entire life to try and use a fork. Have you seen this? It's hilarious because the food keeps falling off, and try to pick up the food and it falls off again, and everyone's just laughing riotously hard. And yet, there's the Jerry Seinfeld joke. You know what I like about the Chinese? They've seen the knife and fork, and they still use the chopstick. And the joke is on him, right? He's missed this idea of niche specificity, that, the ways in which the fork seems so obvious, and the skills and the coordination and the musculature that we've developed in order to manipulate it are completely specific to our particular niche, and that if you don't have those, it's not at all obvious that this is a useful way to convey food to your mouth at all. So I'll stop now since the ladybug has gone off, and thank you.
Anne. It's now open to, yes, Dan.
Yes, thank you, Anne. That was fabulous.
Thank you.
I have the question you're probably expecting to hear, which is whether people have to know what the function is for there to be a function. And I can give you a series of simple examples that a peacock is not aware of the function of his tail. But I don't think anyone in evolutionary biology doubts that the tail has that function, a display function, for example. You could think of examples like people are semi-aware, half-aware of the fact that a larger office chair sends a signal to students who come in and have to sit on something that doesn't have rollers, for example. And then I can think of even other examples, and I just learned about this, that the function of certain kinds of oval tables in seminar settings, unlike this straight line, is to actually allow people to see more people. So apparently I was completely unaware of this function, even though I've used it. And I can imagine a scenario where one manufacturer might be aware of it and then drop over dead. And then we would continue using oval tables unaware of why we're using them. But once you open the door to unknown functions, then the door becomes open to functional anthropology, which in social science circles was thrown out rather violently 40 or 50 years ago. And there's many of us who want to bring it back in, but this intended and unintended function issue is a really, really huge one, and you must have thought about it much more deeply than I have.
So I'm going to have a question for you in a second. Let me say,
That's what philosophers do.
especially trained to turn the table. So I am developing what I call an anti-intentionalist account of function. So one of the things that happens in philosophy of biology, which is the place in philosophy where people most talk about function, is they assume that artifact function is easy because artifacts are made on purpose by intending agents, and the hard thing is to explain how biological entities have functions, like hearts or something, assuming that they weren't made by an intending agent. And I think that the assumption that artifacts are easy, that talking about the function of artifacts is easy is wrong, and it assumes a kind of intentionalism that I could go on about. I have commitments that make me reject. The idea that the maker's intention has any causal role in determining the function of the object. So I know that isn't quite what you were asking about, but I just wanted to make it clear that that's, so the etiological, this historical kind of account is supposed to give us a normative notion of function that does not rely at all on the intentions of the person who made it. About whether the users have to know, well, I mean, I take it you mean by know, you mean like have the occurrent belief that the function of thus and so is, I mean, if you come in and you sit down at the table, you know, but it could be know how, right? You just have to know how to use it, whether you could state that in terms of, explicit beliefs, I don't think is important.
I completely agree with you there, and I think we're on the same page when it comes to the fact that the mind really gets in the way when it comes to understanding. The body understands all these things. The body understands the purpose of the chair. And so,
so for the fork, right? I mean, this is,
So this is part of the issue of needing to abstract the mind from the role of understanding, and once you do that, then it becomes much easier to. I love this idea of anti-intentionalist functionality. Although Talcott Parsons is hovering over this table, and so I keep looking to the social scientists in the room to find out what you think.
So that's the bit I'm completely ignorant about. So hit me with the functional anthropology.
I won't because it would take us ages. But there was a structural functional anthropology of the 1950s, Talcott Parsons, and a whole range of anthropologists. There's people in this room that are much more that was really violently thrown out by terms of social science. And whenever you talk about functionalism in sociology circles, people throw things at you. I mean, it's really so. You're up against anti-intentionalist functionality. Everyone's going to leap upon you with this question. You're not going back there again. But the way to get back is through the evolutionary door. It's just that it's a very delicate operation. So I admire you tremendously because I'm trying to do it too.
Except I didn't know I was doing it.
It's your body leading you.
Exactly. One thing, just a quick question that I had, and I was interested in the way iteration seems to play in the development of a function.
So important. Yeah.
And so, how necessary is iteration, or can someone just come up with an idea for something? I mean, I often think of iteration as sort of the foundation of creativity, which is a sort of a different conversation. But I was just wondering, how does iteration figure in here?
So it's really important for an evolutionary account of anything that there has to be there have to be iterations of the kind to be passed on. I mean, it's one of the disadvantages of this kind of account that were there such a thing as a sui generis artifact that were completely unrelated to anything else, ex nihilo, completely new unto itself, it wouldn't have a function. And that's something that some people think is a disadvantage of this kind of account, that there have to be iterations in order for something to have a function. And what it means is that were there such a thing as a first instance, it would only get its function retroactively, and that kind of backwards causation makes people uncomfortable. So I'll just come clean about one of the pitfalls. And by the way, I was thinking about this with John Robb's paper from the very beginning. That this to me seems like one of the ways that temporality is built into the material structure of things. If you're thinking about function as one of the things that's part of the morphology and the material of an object, it has this kind of forward-looking and backward-looking structure that you can't eliminate, that some people don't like. But yes, absolutely requires the iteration.
But I wonder if you get some of that iteration, if you, if you're starting with a natural object that then is going to be, used or manipulated for a function. So to use your eating example, suppose I'm wandering on the beach and I find a seashell. Okay, and I say, well, it scoops, I can dig through the sand, I can eat with it, so it wasn't made for that, but now I've added something to it. And then there's the iteration, well, it's got ruffled edges, so I smooth them, I make a handle. Then you get the iterative process of different users for different categories of the scooping aspect. Or the shoveling or whatever. So I wonder if you can start with something in not an artifact, but you start with something natural that then becomes artificial in the application of the function.
Yes,
which will get you around the Aristotelian, four-cause thing with the teleological, that for the sake of which it was created to shovel things.
Well, the teleological part isn't that it's that for the sake of which it was created.
No, I know, you're using teleological in this other way, which I agree with, is that function aspect.
Yeah.
But, and it has a purpose that's linked to function. But you don't want it inherent in the thing from the get-go in that Aristotelian way.
Oh, I see,
Right.
Yes. I'll say the problem, this is what I meant about the problem for this kind of account, is that the first time that someone ever thought of using the seashell this way, before people saw that worked and continued to use seashells this way and then started to modify them and such, that very first instance on this account, if the process had stopped at that very first instance and there hadn't been those further iterations, on this kind of an account, it wouldn't count as the proper function in that normative sense. And that's
or it becomes culturally bound then, because maybe a group of people uses the seashells in this way. So it's still a natural object, but in their cultural community, defined however big or small you want, it is achieving that function. That's what they use when they're going to eat. So I think you would still have it.
And so one of the things that I talk about in this paper related to that are what I call bio-artifacts, living artifacts, things like medical leeches and certain kinds of plants used to form hedges, and and all the kinds of artificial selection practices for animals and stuff like that we engage in, where there was some living thing there initially independent of any human formation that then gets picked up and modified through our activity. I'm using that as kind of my model for this etiological account of artifact function in the first place.
John, did you want to jump in?
Yeah, just briefly. I found it a really interesting paper, and I have lots of things I'd like to talk about at some point with you. But one question here is, the impression I get of your project is that you're taking biological evolution as a model and then saying, well, I see patterns or ways that material culture could follow that. And in that sense, one of the sort of metaphors of that maneuver is that the social environment and social needs that people have fit into the slot that the natural environment has for biological things. But of course, it may work the other way around as well, where we don't use an artifact because it fulfills a certain need. We have a certain need because we have the artifact that will fulfill it. And that's just what I'm wondering is where's the coevolution? Or do you see a coevolution, or is it simply evolution here?
Oh yeah, so that's the that is the coevolution. That's the bit that I didn't really talk much about here, and I haven't developed in the paper. But this, people have a need to cut a roast, and they use their hand and a knife, and then people decide that putting your hand on the roast is dirty, so you're going to use two knives, but a single prong wobbles, so you're going to have two prongs, and then you've got something that's fork-like, and then you start using this fork to get the food to your mouth as well, and you decide that three prongs are better. And I mean, obviously, it's not just this doesn't happen just an individual deciding here or there, but slowly out of a knife you get a fork, and with that, practices change and foods change, and
does it change the people too?
Excuse me?
Does it change the people too?
Yes. So the kinds of foods that so once you've got the three prongs, the kinds of foods you can eat, the things you can do with pasta, the various ways that you can. But really, I mean, as I understand it, people twirl pasta with a single stick, and then when you've got two or three prongs, you can twirl the pasta better, and you can do different kinds of things with the pasta, and so the pasta changes, and table manners alter with all of this, and then it changes the shape of other table artifacts too. So once you've got your two-pronged fork, you don't need a prong at the end of your knife anymore, so you can have a butter knife, rounded edge knife, which seems more polite. And around all of this, there are all kinds of practices that build up, and then new kinds of foods develop, and so tableware shifts a bit. I mean, I see them as co-constitutive in that way, much on the biological model of niche, that an organism develops in a niche where other things are shifting also and causing that thing to shift, and there's a kind of back and forth. That's what I want, anyway.
Yeah, and perhaps I wonder if in the same way, if we're continuing this analogy between material culture and sort of biological evolution, you end up with skeuomorphs in both, where you have things that you no longer serve a function anymore, but continue. You might still set the table with a fork and knife and a spoon, even if you really only need a fork and a knife for that meal. I mean, it means you end up with things that no longer have a function that continue to be used. So that's very interesting.
That's right. And then the thing that I just didn't talk about at all is this notion of exaptation. So something might have one function, and then that performance becomes obsolete, but the thing of that type gets taken up for some other function. So the one that comes to mind right now is what I grew up calling a cigarette lighter in a car. I mean, my children don't even, I still call it the cigarette lighter, and they're like, what are you talking about? That's a plug for my iPod is what that is. And if you want to buy a car now and you want the actual cigarette lighter thing, you have to pay like $500 extra to get one, because now it's a 1.5 volt plug. But the morphology is quite similar, right? And it came out of that. And so that is what it is now, is a 1.5 volt plug. But I remember those little hot things that came out.
So when I hear you say that history gives normativity, and then you define history in terms of bio-artifacts and biological adaptation, it sounds to me like you're providing, and this is obviously putting too fine a point on it, it sounds to me like you're using biology as a way of sharpening up Hegel. Because essentially what you presented here is an argument for the way in which historical development confers a normativity. And that's Hegel's philosophy of history, which, thinking about Stephen's paper before, I mean, in a way what your paper provides is an argument for the History Museum.
I was thinking something along those lines, but I wasn't going to say it out loud.
So can I say? Let me try as a response and see if I've understood you. I think what's very useful about this kind of account is that while the notion of function that I want to use is itself a teleological notion, so things have purposes, they're goal-directed, the historical account is not teleological. So it's really evolutionary in that cold sense. You've just got random change, and you've got pressure on these things. So in a marketplace. Some of them succeed and some of them don't, and the ones that succeed get reproduced. And they may be better adapted to that very local context, but there's no, this is what I meant when I said there's no better adapted or more successful or more developed or more evolved or something to core. It's always just in this very particular niche, which is always changing. So even for that niche, it doesn't stay stable, right? Things are always in flux. So it's actually a very anti-Hegelian notion of history over, right? There's no arch. We're not like headed toward, you know, absolute spirit or anything like that, or consciousness or self-consciousness or any of that.
But he had 3 words that describe your complex process at any time, and that's cunning of reason. Cunning of reason stood for exaptation, stood for schemorphs, stood for possible deviations.
Right, but there's no, right, so with, I mean, that's right about the concept of function, but there's no, we're not like headed somewhere. There's just random change, and we're just changing over time. There isn't any place we're going. We're not getting better. Our artifacts aren't getting better in any deep sense. Maybe more useful for us at a particular time, but there's no improvement. That's the bit that I want to reject. You don't get convinced.
Well, it sounds like that's a conversation maybe we can continue over dinner. Like there's a lot.
Thank you
There's a
all
lot
so
there.
much. I really appreciate it.